You know, I always talk about the fact that I think that Gotenks has the best Oki in the game. What does that mean though? What makes Oki good Oki? Okay, first off, what do you mean? What is Oki? Fighting game definitions. Oki is another way of saying the thing or setup you do after a knockdown. Anything you do can be Oki. A safe jump can be Oki, a meaty can be Oki. It's basically just how you're using the plus frames while your opponent is knocked down. It can be a hit that you do on your opponent right as they wake up, but it doesn't have to be. There's some Oki, like Ghost Oki, that is based on putting something out on the screen for your opponent to deal with. But it doesn't necessarily have to hit your opponent as soon as they wake up. It could just be a guessing game. So what qualifies certain Oki to be better than other Oki? Well, one easy thing to look at is the price. How much does something cost to do? Every character can get Oki after a knockdown of just like a safe jump. This doesn't cost anything, so you can do it every time. But is it effective at mixing your opponent? No, not really. Unless your opponent cannot block wake up meaty high, this is not good for mixing your opponent. But not every character is limited to that as a form of meterless Oki. Some characters have things they can do that strengthen their Oki without spending any resource. There are some characters, like Beerus, who can get Oki all the time without spending any resource, while providing more pressure than the average safe jump. However, a character like Gotenks gets his main form of Oki by spending a resource. He has to spend a bar in order to spawn these ghosts, and these are his main source of Oki. And a character like Cell will use his level 3 as his main source of good Oki. But not only that, a lot of his mix-up is tied to also using an EX move. But the cost of Oki is not the only thing that defines how strong Oki is. What's arguably much more important is the actual threat your Oki provides. Because even if Beerus does something like this with an orb, what is he threatening? He's not threatening anything besides pressure on wake up. He's not actually threatening a mix. Not to say that you can't add layers of mix to this, like obviously you can. If your opponent is committed to just blocking this out, then you can get a high-low off of this. But your opponent has to be committed to blocking this out. Whereas with Cell and Gotenks, even if your opponent isn't committed to blocking this out, like, too bad. That doesn't matter. You have to. Obviously, there are forms of counterplay against Ghost Oki, like reflecting and stuff. The main difference, though, between Oki like this from Beerus and Oki like this from Gotenks, your opponent has to do something against the Oki in order to prevent himself from getting mixed. Beerus has to do something against his own Oki in order to create a mix. The normal Oki is just doing the orb. It's not an inherent mix unless he does something else afterwards. With Gotenks, he just naturally gets a mix by doing the ghosts and then jumping in. Your opponent has to do something to stop that. Not only that, but certain characters just create more of a threat on Oki than other characters. I want to ask you guys, what is the main difference between Gogeta's level 3 Oki and Cell's level 3 Oki? The answer is pretty obvious. Cell gets a left-right off of his level 3 Oki, where Gogeta gets a high-low off of his. Okay, well, that's just like a different form of Oki. Instead of getting hit high-low, you're getting hit left-right. Like they're both a 50-50. Does it matter? It definitely matters, and that's because of the next point that I want to talk about, which is how well your Oki fights system mechanics in the game. And one of those system mechanics that's always important to keep in mind is reflect. How well does your Oki fight reflect? Well, if you're Gogeta, you can obviously reflect bait off of your level 3 Oki. But the main thing about Cell is that he doesn't have to reflect bait off of his level 3 Oki. You can't reflect both ways at the same time. This is a big distinguishment between the two characters. Because in this game, unless you are doing something out of a block string, a high-low will never really be a 50-50. Your opponent always has the chance to reflect. Obviously, this doesn't just negate the high-low. Your opponent can wait out a reflect at any point in time and then just hit you harder for trying to reflect. In most cases, in Gogeta 4's case, since he uses a low anyway, he'll hit you just as hard as he would half the time hitting you with a high-low. But Cell doesn't have to worry about reflect. Gogeta 4 always has to worry about reflect. And this just gives every option Gogeta 4 chooses less of a percentage chance to connect than Cell, because Cell will have a 50-50 chance of hitting your opponent if they don't have anything special to use. He will either hit them on the left or the right. But Gogeta 4 will always have less than a 50-50 chance because your opponent will always have the option to just reflect their pressure. It's not like 33, 33, 33 either. I don't know the math. It's like something weird because you can reflect both of the options of high-low. So it's like paper beats rock and scissors, but there's this third option that beats paper. Someone can do the math for me. What's the percentage chance of the options of a high-low when your opponent can reflect? That's your guys' homework for the day. This isn't to say though that there is no benefit to having a high-low over a left-right. There are definitely certain benefits, but in my opinion, the main ones are more character specific than anything. And a good character to talk about this is actually Gogeta 4, but on defense. And that's because Gogeta 4 has this. A DP that uses a down-down input. And this is important because it is immune to cross-ups. You can't cross up this like you would say a quarter circle input. And that means when you're fighting a character like Cell, you actually do have an option that beats both forms of his normal mix-up. So now, with Cell, he has to do something to counteract this. He can't just do the normal mix-up. He has to do his level 3 and then like try to bait this out from a distance. He can still do that, but he has to ignore his mix-up. Whereas a character like Gogeta 4 only kind of has to ignore their mix-up. They don't really, because if they're mixing another Gogeta 4, if they do a high, it also just doubles as a safe jump. So it's weird, right? Because your opponent thinking that might be like, oh, I'm just gonna block high, because if they expect me to DP, then they're just gonna go high anyways. They're not gonna try to bait it out. But you know, like your opponent thinking that obviously could be like, well, I'm just gonna go low because they're not gonna DP because they think I'm gonna go high because But then your opponent's like, I'm gonna block low because they think I'm gonna block high because they're gonna go low. I would block high if they're doing a normal mix up and they think, I think, they think.
Think and make us think we thought.
But you don't have to sacrifice the mix. You can always do a high-low, quote-unquote, against your opponent, even if they try to DP. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, what the fuck? If blocking low loses to getting hit high, and DPing also loses to getting hit high, why the fuck would I ever block low? Why wouldn't I just DP instead? What an amazing question. So true. Blocking low and DPing do lose to the same option. But those are not the only options in the game for Gogeta 4 to be doing on Oki. Remember how we talked about one of the things that beats a high-low is reflecting. So not only is Gogeta 4 going to be thinking about all these options, he's also going to be thinking about beating reflect. And what's a good way to beat reflect? Just by doing nothing for a second and waiting. And what is a good way to beat DP? By just waiting. So there's actually just so many different layers and levels to this. A giant mind game between you and your opponent. What are you gonna do? It's crazy. It's like, will they, won't they? But you know what Oki doesn't have this problem, or at least has a weaker version of this, is Gotenks. Because unlike those characters, the meaty that you do is not with your character. It's with a projectile. So you can't just DP the Oki. You would have to reflect all the projectiles first and then DP afterwards. But even if you were to reflect all the projectiles, then in that situation, I could wait. So your opponent just has to guess more than once if they want to DP and get out of this. But with Gogeta 4, there's a lot of extra options in situations like this. This isn't just because Gogeta has a down-down DP. Any DP would do the same thing against Gogeta 4. There's just a lot of extra options here that both players have to take into account. And all those extra options just lower the probability of any one hit connecting. And that's the next thing I want to talk about, is the probability of your hits connecting. Gogeta can manage the probability of his moves hitting well, but we can do even better. Okay, so we've talked about characters with left-right Oki and characters with high-low Oki. But what if we could do both at the same time? Base Vegeta has such an amazing form of Oki. Instead of just being able to do a high-low or a left-right, he can do both at the same time. He can hit you on the bottom left, on the bottom right, on the top left, and on the top right. And if you know what you're doing, it looks a lot more ambiguous than that shit. And in this way, base Vegeta never has to sacrifice a mix in order to compensate for a character. When you do this naturally, instead of being a 50-50, this is a 4-way. So your opponent would have to guess with such a low probability of success in order to counteract this. And again, with this, your opponent can't just reflect, because it's a left-right. So even if you're reflecting, you still have to guess properly which direction to reflect. But reversal options like this don't ignore the mix either, because remember what we said about high-lows. If you do the high option, then it's also gonna double as a safe jump. But where this differs from a character like Gogeta 4 is he has to sacrifice some of his mix in order to be safe. He can only do his high, which is just one part of his 50-50. But since base Vegeta also has a left-right on top of his high-low, he doesn't have to sacrifice his mix, because both his left high and his right high will double as a safe jump. So your opponent still has to guess. No matter if they are doing a down-down DP or just trying to reflect, they still have to guess left or right, no matter what. And just to top it all off, one thing that we haven't talked about yet is sparking. Sparking is a very strong system mechanic that can counteract a lot of Oki, especially things like Cell's left-right or Gogeta's high-low. Characters can have sparking baits, and those two characters that I just talked about do have sparking baits. But if they do their sparking bait, they have to ignore their mix-up. Base Vegeta technically also does too, but his tool for sparking baits is this: a cross-up. And you're not limited to just doing this on the right side of someone, you can also do this on the opposite side of them to get a same side. Meaning, base Vegeta has two ways of sparking baiting. One where he does a cross-up, and one where he does a same side. And not only that, but this option can also be used in order to bait reflect. And not only that, this option can also be used to bait these reversal options that characters use. And not only that, but even though this is a reactable thing, your opponent can just see that it's happening and then react accordingly, it is still more of a mix-up than just like a normal same side hit. Even if something is reactable, it can be useful at mixing your opponents. People don't react to just every single thing that you do. And because base Vegeta has two different versions of this, you can't just like see instantly which one he's doing. You have to also see which side of you he's on. Which means this is just such a strong tool at sparking baiting and reflect baiting and baiting out DPs, but also just for hitting opponents that are going to be blocking anyway. This will do it more often than like any other sparking bait. But that is not just on top of any mix-up. It is layered on top of a high-low left-right, which means it's just so much stronger. It's so much stronger. Truly, I think Gotenks has the best version of Oki, but if you were to argue anyone has a better version, to me, it would have to be base Vegeta. This is so strong of Oki. No matter what your opponent has planned, base Vegeta has something to threaten it. Okay, so to summarize, what are the points that make strong Oki? One is the cost of the Oki, or how often you can do it. Some Oki you can do all the time because it doesn't cost any meter. Some Oki you can do sometimes because it costs a bar. And some Oki cost 3 bars, and it is a lot more expensive. But besides that, certain Okis are just better or worse at fighting system mechanics. With some characters, there are certain system mechanics that would beat both options a character would do normally for Oki. But there are other characters where using those same options do nothing to help you from getting mixed. And lastly, what is the probability of your Oki connecting against your opponent? What are all the options you can do, And what options does your opponent have that beat multiple of those options? If your opponent, no matter what they choose, has a pretty low chance of beating your Oki, it's probably some pretty good Oki.